Hello, and welcome to today's conversation on narrative connections, how community groups and organizations can use communications to connect with local media and funders. My name is Whitney Johnson, and I am a program manager with Communities of Opportunity. And today's conversation is supported by COO's Learning Community Strategy, which supports and resources community connections, learning, and solutions for systems change and greater social, economic, and racial equity. The impetus for this conversation comes out of feedback COO has received for more information, ideas, and resources to support community groups and organizations in thinking about and utilizing communications and narrative change strategies, tactics, and tools to strengthen their work, including how to increase their ability to connect with funders and media. So, as COO closes this year and cycle of funding, we would like to offer to community partners this short session about how you can use your communications and narratives to get on the radar of media and other funders. With that, I would like to introduce Victoria Garcia Tamayo, who is a consultant partner of COO and who will facilitate the conversation with our guest speakers today. Victoria is the owner and community consultant of Contacto Consulting and brings over 25 years of working in and with community through her experience in the consulting, nonprofit, and public sectors. Her expertise is in capacity building, organizational development, communications, and community development and engagement, all centered in equity and belonging. Victoria has a graduate degree in community development and an emphasis in public policy and a degree in communications and journalism. She is the co-producer of the Emmy award-winning documentary, Sí Se Puede, Connecting Farmworker Communities. Victoria is a proud immigrant from Colombia, and I am so grateful to be able to work with her and for her expertise and for her being here today. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Whitney, and thank you for all your leadership and all your work with Communities of Opportunity. It is my turn, and I have the pleasure to introduce V. Hua and Aviva Stanford today. V uses they, them pronouns, and V is a writer, filmmaker, and organizer with semi-nomadic tendencies. Much of their work unifies their metaphysical interests with their belief that art can positively transform the self and society. They're the managing editor of South Seattle Emerald, editor-in-chief of the arts publication Redefine, and co-chair of the Seattle Arts Commission. They also previously served as the executive director of the Northwest Film Forum, where they play a key role in making the space more welcoming and accessible for diverse audiences. In 2022, V released the short film, Reckless Spirits, which is a metaphysical, multilingual POC body comedy for a bleak new era, in anticipation of a feature-length project. They're presently pursuing a master's in tribal resource and environmental stewardship under the Native American Studies Department at the University of Minnesota. Aviva Stanford uses she, her pronouns. Aviva is the Senior Grants Program Manager at Washington Women's Foundation. Born in Portland, Oregon, Aviva joined the staff in 2017 after moving to Seattle from New York City. In New York City, Aviva worked at the Natan Fund, a given circle that funds Jewish and Israeli social innovation. As part of her work with Natan, she helped build and manage Amplifier, a global network of given circles inspired by Jewish values. Aviva earned a BA in Urban Studies at Barnard College. Locally, she's a member of Social Justice Fund, a graduate of Leadership Tomorrow, class of 2020, and on the steering committee for the Seattle chapter of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. Thank you so much, V and Aviva, for being with us today. So I'll just go ahead and get us started with some questions. We hope that this is a conversation very informal and informative for our community partners. And with that, I'll just kick it off. How could stories help scaling and sharing cultural, policy, or systems change work and contribute to a broader systems change narrative ecosystem?
How are we going to decide who starts off these questions, Aviva?
I don't know.
Start this one, and we'll go from there. So I just, yeah, sure. Obviously, jump in whenever. So I just think in general, storytelling is crucial to advocacy work, period, because it allows for a tangible way for people to sort of like plug into a concept that might otherwise be often inaccessible or hard to understand or too data driven or policy oriented. I remember this one time I saw, you can advocate at city council, for instance, and people offer testimonies that are often personal. And one of the most powerful things I've seen is a group of young people who were organized by an organization to basically like go up and tell their stories around juvenile detention and prison reform. And because they were speaking from their own voices and telling their own stories, it just provided so much more of a like emotional access point for people. So I think stories are just crucial, and it's even in grant writing, for instance, like qualitative or quantitative data is important, and grant writers grant makers ask for that all the time, but also like pairing that with storytelling and qualitative data is always like helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. You captured it so well, V. Stories move people in ways that data just can't. And definitely I've seen that in real time at the Washington Women's Foundation with our membership. There are certain members who are really excited about those numbers, but I would say more so people get really moved and motivated by what they learn from the stories that are shared in grant applications and in connection with organizations. And like what V was saying, I really feel like the stories have to be from and by the community in order to actually contribute to real systems change. They have to feel authentic and like they're from people who are in it and working towards that systems change, impacted by the systems they're trying to change. And that feels necessary to me to ensure that it's not a voyeuristic story, especially in grant making. I've seen some of that voyeuristic storytelling that may advocate for a cause and may absolutely move people, but can also be harmful and exploitative. And so I just feel like the how stories are told and who is telling them is equally important.
Yeah, and I think we will explore a little more of that later. It seems that the larger we kind of continues to be entrenched in this siloed and mainstream, hierarchical, transactional, gatekeeping practices. There were many long words there, but across funding institutions, as well as often in nonprofit work. What are ways you've seen storytelling and narrative work move from that thinking to building collective power?
Do you want to swap off and on, V?
We can try that.
So what this question made me think about, and I don't know if this is exactly answering the question, but it made me think about, the who is telling the story. We recently changed our grant process. We no longer have a full proposal, and instead we're doing our own research. Our members go out and research organizations. And we got feedback from a grantee that it was such a relief because they were so tired of having to constantly educate people. This was a Native-led organization, and they felt like they were constantly doing 101 level education about Native experience in Washington State before they could even get to what they are actually doing. And so to me, I felt like, okay, some of this hierarchical stuff that is so it's just everywhere in philanthropy, some of that could be broken down if we take on some of the work ourselves to educate ourselves. And of course there's challenge there because you want to make sure you're understanding the stories as the communities want to be telling them, right? You're not trying to find information out in a way that is portraying their work incorrectly or anything like that. And there's ways to make sure that you're, checking in and making sure that you're correct in what you're finding without putting that burden, I think, onto organizations, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit of a breakdown of that gatekeeping when you think about who has to take on the work of learning and educating. And the other thing I'll add is that I feel like the storytelling in grant writing and the framing of those stories could come more from a collective power building perspective. I've seen that happen sometimes in grants and even in our short letter of inquiry. And I think one of those, an example of how I've seen it happen is just hearing organizations talk about each other. And I love that. I think it's so informative to understand, okay, organizations aren't working in a silo, right? You're not doing this work alone, and you don't need to pretend that you are and that like you're the only one for the job, right? Like I think more and more funders, and especially we at Washington Women's Foundation, are trying to acknowledge that it's not up to one organization or one person to do the work. It is a collective. And I think it's incredibly impactful when you read a lot of different applications and there's that really honest, respectful acknowledgement of how that collective works together and your unique role in that. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, what are some strategies to demonstrate even to our community partners and also to others who might feel constrained within those funder, nonprofit, media relationships that community has power to force change? What else do you think?
So a little bit of a different spin on this. I think when I think about building collective power, I think about it both internally and externally. So internally, we all want our funders to be less hierarchical and more collaborative, but I think there's work at nonprofits for ourselves to be less hierarchical and more collaborative. So when I was executive director at Northwest Film Forum, we had a shared leadership model between our managing director and our artistic director, and they still have that. And having a leadership team that sort of collectively owns the story and the mission and can tell the story together versus only just like the executive director being the only person who's allowed to do interviews and the only person who knows like deeply the point of the organization or their mission, I think is not enough. And I think in wanting to build the collective storytelling, it's like really having people on your staff really understand the mission and what you're doing together so that you can all sort of like craft and tell that story together. For instance, we had like team values and I began the process, but we all weighed in and it was like a collective group writing project so that by the end of it, everyone's like, okay, this is like what our team values as a whole. That's part of our story. I think in terms of like collective power building externally, so at South Seattle Emerald, for instance, one of our I think most powerful offerings is the section called Voices, and it's our op-ed section, and it's open for community members to submit whatever they need to, get out into the public. If they want to talk about we have one coming up, which is like students at a high school not wanting police in their schools. As resource officers, or we might have like a mental health piece. It really runs the gamut of topics, but having people be able to tell in their own voice through that kind of platform is one potential way also. There's so much other stuff to touch on, but.
Yeah, and as if you think of something else, feel free to just add it. You both have touched on this a little bit, but organizations and partnerships working deeply in community are often and rightfully skeptical of sharing stories with funder groups or with the media because they might be used out of context in exploitable ways, as you have mentioned, or resulting in other negative unintended consequences. Yet they still want to share the work they're doing, the barriers to equity and impacts of racist policies, and et cetera, and other things. All of that in order to support change and bring more resources to the work. Do you have recommendations for how to use communications within this broader context and power imbalance?
Yeah, it's tricky. I'll just talk a little bit on the journalist and maybe Aviva can talk about the funder end. But I know there's been situations where people in community have come to me, and not necessarily at the South Seattle Emerald, but like other publications where they felt like they did an interview and the interview didn't represent them, maybe like quoted them out of context, or and then they didn't feel like they saw enough of the article to be able to or they didn't know to ask to see their quotes, you know, before they were published or something like that. And not all journalists will do that, but I think that's one of the things that it doesn't hurt to ask. Like if you're doing an interview with someone, being like, hey, can you just like run my quote back to me before you publish it so that I can be okay with it? Because, you know, sometimes journalists say they won't do that, but I've known from being on the Northwest Soul Farm side that like sometimes they will. And often they say they won't, but that's because they maybe don't think, I don't know, like they'll give certain people that honor, but certain people they won't. So it's one of those things that you don't know to ask unless you know. But I think it doesn't hurt. So that's one thing. But I also think it's like just relationship based, as with anything. So like getting to know your local journalists as much as possible by pitching them directly or letting them know on a personal email level like what your story is will help maybe get you the type of representation that you want. Not necessarily, but it'll help.
Yeah, I mean, all of that plus one. And I think it happens in the foundation world too. You know, like with any power imbalance, I feel like one step you can take is to name it, you know, name the power that is there. There's such an imbalance in the way that philanthropy operates. And, you know, like that the power lands with the editor, right? Lands with the foundation contact who's putting your blurb in their newsletter or whatever it is. And that piece around making sure your story is shared the way you want it to be shared is important. I love these suggestions around, you know, asking to see the stuff that's going out before it goes out. If you don't want photos or names shared, you know, being really clear about that. I know like we'll often ask for like logos or photos, and we had an organization that works with the domestic violence community, and they were like, we don't do photos. And I was like, oh, duh. You know, but I wasn't thinking that way, but they advocated, they said, can we use our logo instead? And I was like, that's a great idea, let's do that. And so I think that's really important. Like, what are those boundaries, and be really clear on them. And then most funders, I think, especially if you're working with them on like a grantee relationship, will really want to respect those boundaries and help to uplift your work in a way that tells your story in the way you want it to be told.
Yeah, it seems like they are, there are standards, and there's like a standard way of doing things. But in this work of relationships, we all need to be flexible and adapt a little bit. So I think that applies for those relationships with both the media and funders, as you kind of spoken about. The other narrative that is kind of continues to be so ingrained is that narrative of government versus the rest of us, I guess. Do you see a role for philanthropy and the media to build bridges with the government and contribute to coming together? And similarly, between the media and funders, are there opportunities that government can play in moving the work that community is doing across places and groups? And again, vice versa, from philanthropy and media to government to other community partners.
Yeah, I can take a try here. Yeah, I think there's always a role for everyone to work together, no matter if they're representing a government agency or philanthropy or media. I try to stay up to date on what government funding is happening, and there's a lot of really cool projects happening, like, you know, Best Arts for Kids, for example. And I think sometimes philanthropy doesn't have as many restrictions and regulations as government funding streams. So we have an opportunity to be flexible and pilot new things. And then we can sort of go to government and say, hey, we tried this new thing. You should do it too, on a much bigger scale, because you have the scale that a lot of philanthropy doesn't have. And then I think media absolutely is so key to push conversations and really highlight issues so that philanthropy and government has to act in response. It's really powerful. I think we could even see it happening more. I think about in the wake of George Floyd's murder, every foundation on the planet feels like put out a statement and said, pledge some dollars. And yet there's been a real sort of waning interest and focus on racial justice that I've seen. And I know that some media has sort of tracked that and, published that. I've seen some headlines here and there. And I think that's sort of one way that media can help keep philanthropy accountable.
Many ways to take this question. I think for organizations who are curious about how they can impact the government or get funding from the government, knowing that the government is not a monolith, and like there are certain departments and certain people within departments who, like, whether or not you care about government as a whole or like certain leadership, whatever, that there's like community servants who are doing really amazing work. There's really amazing funding that's passing through, community hands all the time. So really paying attention to the different city departments that might be helpful for your individual like needs. So like Office of Arts and Culture, if you're an arts organization, or like Seattle Department of Neighborhoods, like, there's so many departments that have so many funding sources that are useful. It just really requires sort of like looking more deeper into like what they're actually doing and their programs. And it changes from, year to year based on the budget as well. But I think in terms of like the media, we definitely hear directly from constituencies and like lawmakers that like stories that we run or like are put pressure on them to do certain things, or like it helps them understand like what their constituency is like actually wanting or hearing. So I think using media as a tool it can be really powerful. I will say, like, not all media is obviously the same. Like South Seattle Emerald is obviously like a very community oriented paper, but like you won't necessarily always be able to get your voice, I think, out there in the same way in some other publication, but sometimes. So just being realistic, looking at the coverage of different publications and like how they talk about certain issues to understand like where and who to pitch to is like really important, and how to use those like levers, I guess, to get the government's attention. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense. And I was also kind of thinking, not just the media as a whole, but also specific reporters or specific editors who might be really interested in certain topics, and establishing those relationships with specific people too, who are trying to create change within the media itself. Of course, ours is a kind of busy, complex world with many issues that fill our screens and brains every day. How do you focus your work? And this question is more about how do you, as a media person, as a funder, how do you focus where to put your efforts, I guess, or yeah.
I think sort of understanding your vision and the people that you're serving is sort of everything, right? Because that's like, I think the guiding star. And if you're not clear on that, then it's hard to make those decisions. But once you're clear on that, then it becomes easier to sort of like understand, okay, these are the things that we need to do, and these are the strategies we need to take. For instance, at the South Seattle Emerald, like there's too many stories all the time for the number of people that we have and the amount of resources that we have. But it's like, okay, we're focused on the South End. We're focused on issues that we know are important to our communities. These are like, issues around environmental justice and police accountability, and gentrification is a huge one. So if these are the topics that are important, and also like, uplifting community businesses and things like that, if these are the topics that are important, like that's what we're going to center our coverage around, even though there's like other things that are always wanting our attention that are very worthwhile stories, but just given the amount of energy we all have, we can only do so much. So I think it's a similar way in any type of organization, really. Like, what are the main things that we really need to do, and what are the like nice to have?
Yeah, I absolutely take a similar approach. At Washington Women's Foundation, we have our grant criteria is focused on increasing equity and reducing disparities in Washington state, with a specific focus on inequities due to race or gender identity. So that's always top of mind for me when I'm looking for information or reading an article. Sort of always something I'm looking for, in addition to sort of like who's writing this article, who wrote this report, who put that together, you know, looking up people to try to find their background and that kind of thing. Making sure that I'm really looking at like a wide variety of sources of information and not just only reading one publisher. I also look at the issues that we're focusing at right now. So at Washington Women's Foundation, our priority area shifts every year. And so in 2023, for example, we're going to be looking at reproductive justice and maternal health. So I've been doing a lot of learning in that space, again, with that same lens of racial and gender equity on top of that. And there's a lot of really great information out there. I go to the South Seattle Emerald all the time to learn. I'm also a South Ender myself. So like I listen to KVRU on my commute until my radio signal cuts out around Cloverdale. And I'm like, where's KVRU? So I really feel like it's important to like stay connected, both like personally, locally where you are, and also try to broaden that perspective as much as you can. You know, like Seattle Times is really different perspective than, you know, what you might read in South Seattle Emerald. And I might have like a personal bias towards reading South Seattle Emerald a little more than Seattle Times, but that's just me. I do still try to understand how other people are talking about their work, right? Like that's important too. Not trying to trash talk.
No, and I was just gonna say there are people like Naomi Ishizaki who are like really trying and has amazing columns every week. And I'm really
for sure
right looking forward to reading what Naomi has to say, you know, every week, even if I don't read maybe some other sections of the paper. And it's been my experience that the best way of working with both editors, reporters, and funders is by developing and sustaining relationships. And we've talked about this today. And there are also limitations, and we've talked about those too: power dynamics, the aim for objectivity, if that's still a thing, and time. How do people start having a relationship with you as a funder or as a journalist? How can our community partners who might not have relationships with funders or media, how can they build relationships with both?
I love this question because I think relationships are what it's all about. I mean, we've touched on this already in this conversation, and I'm really open to talking to anyone, and I say yes to everything, which is maybe not always so good because, like you say, Victoria, time is a challenge. But I, just send an email, send a cold email and say, hey, I'd love to tell you about my work. Or you could see if there's someone in your network that has a connection that can introduce you if you're not comfortable with the cold email. I understand that's not a comfortable thing for everyone to do. I would say that I really make it a priority to respond to community emails, and I know other funders do too. They might have some limitations about what they can talk about or anything like that, but I don't. I'll talk to all of you. Everyone who's watching right now, I will have coffee with you if you want, or a Zoom call or a phone call, whatever you like, or an email. Email is fine too. Anyway, so I think one of the things that's helpful when you are reaching out is just doing a little bit of looking at their website or looking up their information on their grant programs, just so you know, okay, I do think I'm a good fit, or I have a specific question about if I'm a good fit, so that you can make the most of your time, because your time is valuable. And a lot of times funders will talk to you and won't tell you for sure if you're a fit or not. But I think being really direct and asking questions that will help you make that determination is a good idea. And then after that, follow up. I think it's really interesting when we talk about power dynamics to try to make it more of a mutual relationship, like how can you ask for support, but also offer your own support, come to events, participate in the community. Washington Women's Foundation are shifting the way we engage with our grantees to try to make it more mutual and, make it a support beyond the check sort of relationship. We call it our grantee engagement team. And, it's really fun and interesting to explore that. So try to see what you can do in that space and in that spirit. And you don't also have to wait for them to ask, what can we do to support you? You can just say, hey, you should come to this, or hey, can you put us in your newsletter, or, hey, do you know someone I should talk to? Ask your current foundation partners, grantees, if they can help you make connections. If there's a grant coming up that you think would be a really good fit, but you haven't been able to make that connection, see if they have a contact, see if they know someone in the media that they can connect you with. Now I know V, I can say, hey, talk to me, and the world goes round.
Indeed. Yeah. I think everything Aviva said, for sure. It never hurts to like reach out. I think both I've learned that from being on a publication side, but also, being someone pitching to a publication, to have a personal email that shows that you actually did your research is really helpful. Obviously, that takes like a little more time to be like, okay, this writer actually covers these environmental topics or whatever that I want to pitch. But it goes a long way to send like a personal letter versus like a spam email to like everyone. I will say like a targeted email versus like an email to like 5 people where everyone on the email doesn't know who should be responding, like that is not effective strategy. So being targeted, doing your press releases, getting a list of press contacts locally and maybe nationally that might be interested in telling your story, is all really like useful stuff, I'd say.
How can communications and how can stories, the stories shared with the media and funders help build narrative power?
Are we talking about the narrative power for the like organization to like build their story, or?
Yes, and that narrative power of kind of collective power, building that ecosystem of collective power. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched on this, I think, at the beginning, when you were talking about the importance of stories and how the stories are told and who is telling those stories. Is there anything else that you think of that could help build that kind of narrative power and collective power?
Yeah, I think just in terms of like just even thinking like through what is the story that I'm trying to tell that is actually like compelling and has like a person attached to it or an impact attached to it versus just like, we do work, around youth education is like, great. Like you do work, you have some workshops coming up, great. But like, what is the impact and what is the actual story and who are the people telling that story? Is like, I think part of like how you build the narrative power, and then like the impact, not just in you doing this one task, but in terms of like the broader sort of like ecosystem as well. Like, how does your work fit in with the ecosystem? Like why your organization when there's so many other organizations out there who are doing maybe similar things, maybe different things, but like what makes you special? Like, I think, when we're as filmmakers, I'm a filmmaker. So like when one of the questions is like, why are you the person to tell this film right now? Or like write this film right now? And there's so many potential projects out there. So I think it's a very similar thing with an organization. Like there's so many similar ideas floating around, and that can be disheartening, but that can also be encouraging when you think about your unique, thing that you have to bring to it that nobody else can do better than you. Yes, that's my advice.
I love that, V. Yeah, I really feel like it's kind of like this ripple effect. Like if you do build narrative power and have control over your narrative, like it ripples out, right? Like you're not sure exactly who will hear the story and then tell it to their friend and tell their grandma. And then the way we start talking about an issue shifts, like you don't exactly know the impact right away, but it's so powerful. And so the more you share your story, the more narrative power you build and get people talking about your work the way you want them to talk about it, as opposed to sort of like mainstream, which might be sort of like a more negative framework. Like, honestly, one of the things I love about South Seattle Emerald is like there's so much joy, and I get to really feel connected to all the amazing work happening in my community, and it's coming from my neighbors as opposed to just top down. Here's some bad news. You know what I mean? Like, they cover the hard stuff too, but like I feel like there's that sort of like, you know, we talk a lot about power sharing in philanthropy. Like, I feel like that's a big value at Washington Women's Foundation. It's a big thing we talk about all the time. And, you know, if you really are power sharing in communications, that's what that looks like. It works like reworking the narrative, you know, being exercised control in the narrative that might have been denied previously. You know, there's a lot of like, there's this concept of stock stories, like standard stories out there, and there's a lot of them that we can take down through building narrative power. That was a lot of words, but hopefully they made some sense.
I think also like coalition building with the partners you are, you know, working with, and having joint, you know, press releases or joint stories that you're pitching together based on your collective relationships. I think about this one story that I wrote recently about the King Street Station like development with a bunch of art hubs with the Cultural Space Agency. So Red Eagle Soaring's in there, Rhapsody Project, Totem Star, a bunch of other organizations. But because there's like so many people as a part of this one project, like suddenly it became like something where, you know, every publication wrote about it, versus like if it was just one organization's capital campaign, like maybe one or two people might have written about it, but because it was like a collectively shared hub, like suddenly it became undeniable. So like we work with community partners as nonprofit organizations all the time. Like, how do we tell our stories together and pitch together and leverage our collective relationships together also?
That was beautifully said. As we are closing today, is there anything else that you would like to share that we didn't talk about? Are there any other recommendations so that community groups can use communications and narratives to get on the funders and journalist radars? And it could be anything specific or practical steps or more structural change. Anything else that we didn't talk about that you would like to share?
I don't know if this is good advice or bad advice, but I feel like I want folks to be unapologetic about the work that they're doing. I feel like sometimes there's a pressure to sort of like adapt your narrative to what you think funders want, or trying to like play the game, I guess, of watering down your work. And I think hopefully, I mean, I don't know, there's questions around like where we're at with racial justice conversations, but like not being afraid of like telling your actual story or like your actual work. And if, you know, funders don't understand that, then they're probably not the right funder for you.
I can't underscore that enough. Like, that's so important. Like, for a funder, from a funder perspective, like I want to know how you actually talk about your work, and not like what you think I want you to hear. What you think I want to hear?
Yes.
Many words, but I mean, it's important, you know, it's because I think one of the things I liked about doing the research as opposed to doing a full proposal is I got to see how organizations talk about their work to each other and to their community, as opposed to a carefully scripted proposal that was made just for me as the funder. And I would say, that I love that encouragement to be unapologetic. I would add like my encouragement to just give it a try, you know, like you just be brave and put yourself out there and make those connections and try to build those relationships. And even if you get a no, like that could plant the seed for a future yes. And did that make you think of something, Bea?
Yes, that's actually a thing. Okay, so yeah, recently I was talking to someone who's like a new ED, and she's like, I don't even want to apply for these grants anymore. I didn't get it. So many rejections. And I'm just like, you still gotta do it. Like, I think rejections are super disheartening. And I think often people don't understand how certain grant processes work, and they're just like, oh, one person's like making all the decision at this city grant or something. That's not necessarily the case. And I think looking into like how are their decisions actually being made, sometimes helps people understand like you know, it is okay to apply because there's like a panel of people and it's not just me. And even if I don't get it this year, I might get it another year. So I think, yeah, that encouragement that if you don't get it one year, it doesn't necessarily mean you won't get it ever. It's just, you know, it's competitive. That's how it works.
And ask for feedback, you know, like
Yes.
not all funders will offer feedback, but I always ask, and I always offer feedback, and I'm surprised that not everyone wants to. And sometimes I have something specific to share from the grant committee, sometimes I don't. But even if I don't have something specific, I will have that conversation, and that's another way to build relationship, right? Every touch point helps to build that understanding of your work and what you do. Yeah.
Yeah, and questions beforehand too, in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely.
And similarly with the media, sometimes the timing of a story might not be the right, the right time for that particular story, or maybe the angle might be just not quite there. And just kind of talking about it. I know that in a story that V and I actually worked on together, we adapted it until it just made sense to tell the story of the organization and the great work that they were doing. So there is a question in the chat to finish. What is your advice or suggestion for groups or partnerships whose stories or messages might not have a hook that people typically find interest in? For example, stories with the relational learning, organizing, convening, the kind of nitty-gritty work of systems change. How to talk about and tell those stories that can get broader interest?
It's such a good question. I don't know, I'm mulling a little bit.
I mean, I argue there's always a hook, regardless of what. You just got to find the right representative and the right little like point that has something to tell that's understandable for people.
Yeah, what's that connection point, right?
So we're talking about, like, for instance, like systems change, boring, but then you have a film like 13th, about like tracking the entire history of why this country is oppressive towards Black people through the prison system. Like, that's hella nitty gritty, but there's a story to tell and there's a hook. So I feel like there's always a hook. You just gotta like find it.
I would think about like, I always give the advice to people who are writing a grant proposal to Washington Foundation to think about like how you would tell your story to your neighbor or like your friend or your grandma. And like that makes it a little more accessible. I don't know if that answers the story about a hook, but it does help, might help you find that hook if you think about like what would pique your, I keep saying grandma, but what would pique your grandma's interest, what would make her excited about what you're doing? And that might make, help you find that hook, help you find that like broader appeal in a way. I guess I miss my grandma.
Yes, I think you do. Time to call your grandma, Viva.
Like, this is a new nonprofit idea. It's like a grandma, like, advice.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation. And as many of our community partners are transitioning into maybe other projects or advancing the work that that you are currently doing with communities of opportunity or in collaboration with other funding partners, I hope that you continue to use your storytelling and narrative to build that collective power. And as you heard, there are many media and funding partners like we and Aviva who are ready to work with organizations like yours in building these relationships. So try it. And thanks again, V and Aviva, for your time and for for all your words today.
Thank you both / all.
It's my pleasure to be here, and definitely happy to share my contact information with folks if that's helpful.
Great, we'll add that to the recording. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.